Dear colleagues, I am very pleased to be among you, to be invited here, and to come back to thinking of public history fate in Russia, which I think is rather good. My topic is about Great Patriotic War in Russian diaries. Great Patriotic War is a substitute for World War II in Russian. And you know, very often we talk, and we talk here as well, about what professional historian can do for public history, for public historians. But is public history helpful for professional historians? Can it contribute, benefit? Can professional historians benefit from public history? That is my question, and that was my case. We had such a site, Prozhito, in Russia. Prozhito, I think the best translation is lift, or the life lived. The life was going on, something like that. And I came across it 5 years ago and started to read diaries just for interest. It was interesting. I am not specialist in Russian history except of history of Russian science. I am not specialist in ego history, not at all. But I just read diaries one after another, because this site appeared in 2015 as a volunteer project with the aim of collecting in one electronic library the most complete database of diaries of the inhabitants of Russia in the 18th, 21st centuries, both published and previously unknown. By September 2021, the site hosted 8,419 diaries in Russian, 157 in Ukrainian, and 59 in Belarusian. Now you cannot find such data on the site. They disappeared. By September 2021, the site hosted 419 diaries. The maximum number of diaries, 2,500 out of 8,500, falls on the years of World War II, 1941-1945, of which about 500 diaries are diaries of the residents of besieged Leningrad, that's Petersburg. That is quite understandable because the site team is located in St. Petersburg, so of course they mostly acquired diaries from St. Petersburg inhabitants. Anyway, at the website Prozhito, one can find out information about age, profession, localization, and the future fate of a diarist. Bibliographical details of published diaries and references to more detailed sources, if this exists. And I have no time to read you any extracts from the diaries, no entries, but I want you just to flip through the pages and read them themselves. And here is information about the site. In my opinion, the Prozhito initiative is a perfect example of a successful public history and participatory culture. The project team includes professionals, historians, and web developers, but in order to find, process, and upload thousands of diaries, thousands of working hours of various people were required. And since the project was opened, more than 500 volunteers have passed through it, most of which are not even humanitarians. So we speak about a great project of creating a database with the efforts of 500 of public historians, just public, not even public historians. The topic of World War II was not as actual when I decided to write a paper about it, but it became actual now because World War II, as you probably know, for our government and personally for President Putin, is one of the foundation of Russian patriotism. It's the main event in the Russian history for the last years, is Soviet people victory in World War II. So they are very attentive to the interpretation of the history of war, and with regret I should say that the best institute on the history of World War II in Russia was closed yesterday. It was the Institute of Oleg Budnitsky. Partly because the topics they researched for the last 10 years were not in which the government is interested in. It was about refugees, everyday life, collaborates, fugitives, and so on, evacuees, KGB role in military actions, and so on. So they are closed. And it's just coincidence it happened while we were here. Soviet people in Stalin's time, I mean before the war, were very reluctant to keep diaries. They were just afraid to do it. Those who did this hid them even from family members, often destroyed them, burned, or fell silent for years. The latter can be seen from many diaries with emptiness from 1937, 1941. At the same time, in USSR, common people were trained to keep diaries, which was practiced first by Soviet psychologists who considered diary helped to make a real communist from a common person. And later, by Maxim Gorky, the writer, whose idea was to write a history of industrialization of Russia, and he thought that industrial diaries, just entries of the plain workers who took part in the industrialization, would be very helpful. And as they said, study yourself in everything, how and why. A diary should be written in such a way that a worker or any other person asks himself what he did of value on that day. And reading these diaries written under these party surveillance, Johann Helbeck and Stephen Kotkin, the famous historians of the Soviet past, drew their famous conclusions about the formation of Homo Sovieticus. You probably know the term, how Homo Sovieticus was coined during the first decades of Soviet power. And today we meet the extrapolation of this theory of Homo Sovieticus, to the modern Russian who supports President Pushkin. Just recently I read Roger Cohen wrote in New York Times, I found that Homo Sovieticus, far from dying out, has lived in a modified form along with habits of subservience. My assumptions about the style of the wartime diary writing were based on a vague supposition rooted in the works on the ego documents of the Soviet people of the 20s and 30s, reading which Helbeck and Kotkin drew their famous conclusion about Homo Sovieticus. I should say that one of them read only 17 diaries. I don't think that a lot was sampled at that time, but it was enough to show that the style, the language, the discourse of these diaries really belonged to Soviet person. not to independent individuals. And my assumption was the same, but the numerous wartime diaries I came across looked completely different. So my motivation for this presentation on this study was cognitive dissonance, or I should say perplexity. I didn't expect that people started to write diaries on their own, with their own words. I felt increasingly surprised because this text hardly reflected the official great narrative, which was already in the making during the war by press, radio, cinema, and literature. Ordinary people who were expected to employ models and stereotypes, they lived with radio turned on. They had police information on the front line at nights, and anyway, they wrote differently. They left memories of their personal extreme experiences, which did not remind official ones, either in expression or in contents. At the same time, diaries demonstrate the coherence of the contents of these texts. Main topics, examples of experiences, characteristics of emotion were similar, in spite of the fact that diaries, of course, were produced by individuals writing privately. Diaries reflect the war through personal lenses, but when one reads a large collection of such diaries, a pattern of shared experience emerges. I have no time to prove it. You have just to trust me that I sell Pravda. But it is like that. And even if I could read all these entries from the diaries, it will not be anything but Pravda. But I should say that I read 72 diaries, I think, and it was random sample. 72 diaries is not a few. First, I was surprised that so many people kept diaries, because they didn't before the war. In the trenches, under fire, in freezing conditions, everywhere, even during partisan raids, during blockade, in the concentration camps, on the occupied territories, everywhere, they kept diaries. And here is some explanations written by people why do they did it. Now about the sample. Is it left? Or 2 minutes left? Okay. I have selected wartime diaries according to the following principle. I have studiously avoided the diaries of well-known figures, writers, academics, and so on, because I think that public persons familiar with the tradition of ego documents when making diaries wrote themselves into history, which common people do not. So putting aside very short diaries and diaries with very short entries, which are more like a date book, I selected 72 diaries. This absolutely random sample, in a sense, that I did not select diaries for the task of the study. I just went by alphabet and took, mostly it was A, B, C, D in Russian, it's another alphabet, but then I added T and so on, but random sample. But it happened that authors of diaries varied in the social status, age, gender, education, attitudes to the Soviet and Nazi, where it already was authorities, details of their war experiences. They were soldiers, partisans, peasants, school children, students, evacuees, and so on. And of course, the extrapolation of my conclusions based on selected diaries of World War II is no more justifiable than any extrapolation based on huge massive data. But my conclusions are like that. I still have 1 minute. First of all, probably I left my conclusions in the handout, but probably I add several words about language people used. When I talk about language, I mean the correlation between official discourse of war, stereotypes, cliches of speech, standard models of usage, typical combinations of verbs, syntax construction, as well as general models of speech in particular situation and individual ones suited to the expression of personal experience. People not used to writing often fall to literal cliches. Cliches were used by many diarists, especially if they wrote about the enemy, Nazi beast, bloodthirsty dogs, dirty hands of mad enemy, police bastards, and so on. And this is not surprising. What is surprising is that cliches were used sparingly, and the diarists in general remained expressive and original in their reflection of war. Helbeck and Hopkins shown that Soviet society revealed a kind of diglossia in respect of usage stereotypical models. That just 30 seconds. And diglossia is important, but my diaries were sincere in their writings on the pages of their diaries, and if they shifted between two languages, they hardly made conscious choices determined by the context of usage. Rather, this happened because they had already interiorized official language for some topics I noted. In general, the diarists very rarely used cliches, and such, the name of Stalin, for example. Sometimes you made it twice on a big diary, in a big diary. Sometimes you do not meet his name. And you know that when Soviet army attacked, every time they went for Stalin, for Stalin, for Stalin. And the same about the wisdom of CPSU and the other such cliches which show the ideology in the language. It is almost used, I swear, that's правда. Thank you. Thank you.